I welcome members and also viewers who may be watching proceedings on Oireachtas TV to the public session of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Children and Youth Affairs. The purpose of today's meeting is to discuss the recruitment and retention of social workers. In the first session, the committee will hear from representatives of the Irish Foster Care Association, and in the second session, the committee will hear from representatives of the Irish Association for Social Workers. On behalf of the committee, I'd like to welcome the Irish Foster Care Association and Ms. Catherine Bond, the Chief Executive. Ms. Sharon O'Donnell, Media and Communications Officer, and Mr. Andrew Murphy, Support Service Coordinator, Irish Foster Care Association. And you're both very welcome. Thank you for coming. Before we commence, in accordance with the procedure, I am required to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise nor make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name in a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. I may also remind members, witnesses and indeed our guests in the public gallery to please switch off your mobile phone as they may interfere with the sound system and make it difficult for the parliamentary reporters to report on the meeting, and it also adversely affects television coverage and web streaming. I wish to advise you that any submission or opening statement you've made to the committee will be published on the committee website after this meeting. After your presentation, there will be a question and answer exchange from members of the committee. And I now call on Ms. Bond to make your opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chairperson, members, on behalf of the Irish Foster Care Association, I would like to thank you for the invitation to address the Joint Committee on Children and Youth Affairs today. I'm accompanied by my colleague Andrew Murphy of IFCA. Andrew is a project worker with IFCA's National Support Helpline. The Irish Foster Care Association is a representative body for foster care in Ireland and promotes excellence for foster care. IFCA has 2,036 members, comprised of foster families, social workers, social care workers, academics and those with an interest in foster care. I have included some more information about IFCA in Appendix 2 of our submission, so I won't dwell on that any further. Foster care is the backbone of care for children who are in the care of the state in Ireland. Ireland is unique insofar as the majority of children who are in the care of the state grow up experiencing family life, which is testament to the value and importance of family in our society, and this is reflected in our legislation. We need to celebrate the fact that the majority of these children are growing up as happy, confident young people who attend school every day. Children in foster care are thriving, and foster families are offering secure, happy and fulfilling childhoods to children, supporting them to reach their full potential. The recent report by the Irish Penal Reform Trust found that, in general, children in foster care are not involved in juvenile justice. This is another positive indicator for children who grow up in foster care. You've invited IFCA here this morning to talk about the recruitment and retention of social workers in Tusla. The role of the social worker is central to the care system for children in Ireland and for foster families. The majority of children in the care of the state live with foster carers. At the end of September 2018, there were 6,044 children in care, of which 92% of those were placed in foster care, 26% of those being with relative foster carers. During the same period, there were 3,287 foster carers on the Tusla foster care panels. Tusla, the Child and Family Agency, has a statutory responsibility to approve foster carers and place children with them. The National Standards for Foster Care makes provision for Tusla to contract other agencies to provide foster care on its behalf. The National Standards also requires Tusla to ensure that foster care placements are adequately supported and that children in care have an allocated social worker. The process of becoming a foster carer is rigorous and governed by the procedures and guidelines for the foster care committees, which outlines the assessment process of prospective foster carers, which are conducted by social workers. Foster care committees are convened by Tusla and they approve foster care applicants. Reports on the reviews of foster carers, recommendations to remove a foster carer from the fostering panel, the outcomes of investigations of allegations made against foster carers and placement breakdowns are also adjudicated by the local foster care committee. Therefore, the role of the social worker is central to all aspects of foster care. The National Standards for Foster Care in Ireland sets out a range of standards to be attained for the child, for the foster carer and by TUSLA. Specifically, there is a requirement for the child to have a dedicated social worker and for the foster carer to have a dedicated linked social worker who provides support to the foster carer. The Child and Family Support social worker visits the child in the foster home and maintains links with the child's birth family. This role centres on a responsibility for the safety and the welfare of the child. The national standard sets out the requirement of the roles of the child and care social worker and for the linked social worker, and the specific requirements of each of these roles is outlined in Appendix 1. Standard 5 of the national standards requires that there is a designated social worker for each child and young person in foster care. Standard 14 also requires for the assessment and approval of foster carers by a trained and qualified social worker. Standard 15 requires that approved foster carers are supervised by a professionally qualified social worker, also known as a linked social worker, to ensure that foster carers have access to information, advice, professional support to enable them to provide high-quality care. Standard 16 requires that foster carers participate in training necessary to equip them with the skills and knowledge required to provide high-quality care, and Standard 17 requires foster carers to participate in regular reviews for the continuing capacity to provide high-quality care and to assist with the identification of gaps in their fostering service. The provision of both Standards 16 and 17 is also a requirement of the linked social worker. The above standards are clear in the requirement for social workers to carry out these statutory functions. Without the required numbers of social workers, there are significant pressures on our children in care system. Members, you have invited IFCA today to discuss the challenges to the retention and recruitment of social workers in TUSLA. The requirements and roles of the social worker is many and varied, and it is for this reason I have listed those requirements as set out in the National Standards for Foster Care in Appendix 1 of this paper. The child in care is required to have his or her own social worker, and the foster carer is also required to have their own linked social worker. There are currently over 6,000 children in foster care and 4,500 foster families, all who require the services of social workers. IFCA is aware that the current shortfall of social workers and of foster families and children who today do not have an allocated social worker. The shortfall is acute in some local TUSLA areas. The challenge is that the many requirements for children and foster carers as required under the National Standards for Foster Care are not being met. For example, some foster carers do not have a linked social worker. The impact of this is that they do not have access to the supports as required, particularly when the foster carer themselves requires supports, identifying pressures building within a placement. Research indicates that prior to making of an allegation of abuse against a foster carer by a child, the foster carer notes increased behavioural problems and many request respite supports prior to the allegation being made. For the child, the absence of a dedicated social worker does not allow them to build and maintain a meaningful relationship with the person who is charged with being their corporate parent. It is important for children to develop a trusting relationship with their social worker, particularly if they're unhappy with any aspect of their placement. On a very practical level, the child's social worker is responsible for giving consent for all aspects of a child's life, going on school tours, sleepovers with friends, travelling with the foster family. The absence of a social worker to give written consent may mean that the child cannot participate in normal everyday activities as other children. IFCA is aware of the ongoing strategies of TUSLA to recruit more social workers, and as is true with any employer, key in the recruitment of staff is also the retention. It is noted that during 2018, whilst 142 social workers were employed within TUSLA, that 158 social workers also left as a result of retirement and movement to different sectors. This places great strain on TUSLA to meet its statutory requirements for children in care and for foster carers. Analysis of the reasons for the movement to other employment of any staff through exit interviews informs an employer's staff retention strategies and may inform TUSLA of the causes of such movement. It has also been suggested in presentations to the committee by other contributors that the number of social worker graduates annually falls short of the requirements of TUSLA, and that the Minister and her department have initiated discussions with the third level institutions to seek solutions. The rationale for setting out the role and responsibility of the child in care social worker and that of the foster care linked social worker is to propose that some aspects of the role could be carried out by a transdisciplinary team to include a range of suitably qualified professionals. TUSLA could develop social work allied health professional teams which provides a range of services and supports to children in care and foster carers, supervised by a team social worker. The combination of roles and responsibilities could enhance the service to children and foster families appropriately, but also reduce some of the requirements of the social worker, enabling them to focus on the key statutory requirements of their role. For example, a social care worker or allied health professional could support the child during access visits with their families if they are uncontested. They could also assist in coordinating care planning meetings or coordinate professionals meetings and make referrals for specialist services for the child under the direction of a social work team leader. Allied healthcare professionals could support foster carers in aspects of their role during doing one-to-one work with children, whether practical or therapeutic, and offering timely support to foster carers, with the linked social workers retaining the supervisory role. All of this work would support the work of the social worker, who always holds the statutory responsibility. Greater enhanced rights for foster carers could eliminate the requirement for the social worker to give consent, and where a child is in long-term stable placement, the foster carer could assume more autonomy. IFCA has already included this suggestion to the DCYA in its submission in the review of the Childcare Act 1991. Such support to the current social workers would reduce some of their core role, as well as having manageable more caseloads, and thus supporting retention. Other supports to the role of the social worker could be to engage in organisations such as IFCA, the representative body for foster care in Ireland, to coordinate and offer training and support groups to foster carers in collaboration with and on behalf of TUSLA. IFCA is in the unique position that it currently provides such services already. TUSLA takes a child into care when there is a concern for the welfare and protection. Frontline social work is demanding and challenging, and social worker staff working in this area require manageable caseloads and higher levels of support. Consideration could be made to having a lessened caseload, higher levels of support and supervision, and offer additional allowances to those working at the front line to ensure retention of skills and knowledge. The challenges of entering social work can be great and overwhelming for any new graduate. Consideration could be given to offering new social work staff a mentor for the first 12 months of their new role. This would support the new social worker and provide them with access to expertise and knowledge as they embark upon their new role within TUSLA. Group supervision and peer support is also evidence has been a great support in learning to all staff. Having forums which offer regular peer support and shared learning would enhance the employment environment for new staff. The UK and Northern Ireland universities offered social work qualifications to social care staff who wish to attain a qualification in social work. These qualifications are gained through a combination of in-work placement and part-time study. Currently, any postgraduate student who wishes to study social work in Ireland must return to college on a full-time basis. This is not feasible for many employed in social work staff. Additionally, social care staff generally work in the areas of residential care, addiction and homeless services, which offers them a comprehensive insight into the challenges faced by children and families. These staff have a wealth of knowledge, skills and expertise to bring with them to the study requirements of social work. To attract such students, bursaries could be offered by TUSLA to attract social care work to study social work in third-level institutions who will provide this mode of study and will then be required to remain in employment with TUSLA for a defined period of time. In conclusion, committee members, IFCA welcomes this opportunity to share its knowledge and experience of foster care in Ireland with you, and our suggestions for the recruitment and retention of social workers in TUSLA who play a vital role in the area of children in care in Ireland, of whom there are 6,500. IFCA advocates for excellence in foster care in Ireland on behalf of our members, and we work closely in collaboration with TUSLA to achieve this. We are fully supportive of TUSLA's drive to recruit and retain social work staff and offer our suggestions to support this. Foster care is the backbone of childcare in Ireland and requires a robust infrastructure to support it. Without social workers and the required supports, this cannot be achieved. Foster carers must receive the supports required to enable them to care for children with very complex children on behalf of the Irish state. Supports must be timely and available, and foster carers should not have to lobby for services which are a right for these children, or for a right to have a dedicated social worker to support them in their fostering role. The national standards for foster care requires that both children in care and foster carers have dedicated social workers. IFCA acknowledges that TUSLA has made improvements in the allocation of social workers. However, to achieve full complement of staff to meet these needs of both children in care and foster carers, we need to identify other ways to ensure that the requirements of the national standards of foster care is achieved. This may be achieved through the implementation and suggestions proposed here by IFCA today. Thank you, Chairperson and members.
Thank you very much, Ms Bond. I think your concluding line is the be-all and end-all, I suppose, of the purpose of the committee hearings to determine how we can get more social workers into the system and keep them there. But thank you very much for your opening statement. I now invite Deputy Chambers, who's indicated first.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Ms Bond and Mr Murphy, for attending the committee this morning. I have to say, perhaps it's just me, but I was really shocked to read that there were over 6,000 children in state care. That is far greater than I would have expected. And I think that's it's sad, actually, that there's that level of children that have to go into state care, and obviously puts huge pressure on the system and on foster care families. Do you know roughly how many cases, what the caseload would be of a social worker? So how many, for a linked social worker, how many families would that social worker ordinarily have in their workload? Or for somebody working with the child, how many children would they have? How many children in foster care would they have to manage? I suppose my question is, are social workers currently working way beyond capacity and kind of maxing out their capacity? You say that the national standards for foster care are not being met because of the shortage of social workers. Would you be able to identify what standards are not being met? I know you've provided a list at the back in the appendix. Just what standards do you think are kind of, I suppose, been left to one side? You also say that there's a shortfall in social workers when it's more acute in some TUSLA areas. Where are the problem areas in the country? And just I take on board, and I would agree with you around some of the solutions, and it's really great to see that you've offered some solutions here as to how we might address this problem, because there's only so many graduates we can get through college at any one time. But certainly enhancing the rights of foster carers to do more, to maybe sign consent forms, that seems really practical and reasonable. What was the response of the department when you made that suggestion? Or are you still waiting for a response? And I'm also particularly interested in the suggestion that social care staff, the fact that they have to go back to full-time education, when in the UK there's the in-house training and part-time study, which makes far more sense. Obviously, if you're in full-time work and you're paying bills and looking after a family, leaving work to go study full-time just isn't feasible. So again, have you put that to the department, and what has their response been? Thank you.
Okay, so just, thank you very much, Mr Chambers. Just the caseloads in social workers and children and care social workers and link social workers for foster carers, I suppose we don't have a definitive number. There is an approximate guideline around 30 cases per social worker, but that can be quite high depending on the complexity of children in care. We also note from our own members who are foster carers that if there is a new infant placed in foster care, that the court can actually direct that the foster carer bring that baby to access maybe 4 or 5 times a week, which is to attain and retain and develop an attachment with the child's birth parent, which is crucially important. But that also then requires that social worker to ensure that that access happens. The courts are also directing that social workers report to the court on a more frequent basis, particularly with younger placements. So that's all quite whilst very important, but it's very time demanding for a social worker. So it's around, and it's really for TUSLA to respond to this kind of question. I think it's that in terms of weighting caseloads, and there are structures within TUSLA to weight caseloads. So just in terms of the standards not being met, I suppose recent HICRA reports, and the most recent HICRA report, which was a combined report of foster care standards, highlighted, I suppose, maybe areas like the need for foster care reviews to be undertaken. This wasn't an area that was being conducted in the past. And the foster care reviews, so within the national standards for foster care, foster carers are required to undergo a review every 6 months after the first placement and a number of years thereafter on a regular basis. And this is an opportunity for the foster carer to reflect on the foster care placement, reflect on their own learning and development, and reflect on the needs of the children whom they're caring for. So the incidence now of conducting more reviews for foster carers is also placing more time restrictions on social workers. So I suppose it's about finding a fine balance of the realistic demands of the increased demands of the needs for foster carers and the increased demands for children in care, and what's reasonable and realistic for a social worker to carry in that respect. Yes, thank you. And just again, as my colleague mentioned, there is a requirement for social workers to provide regular support and supervision to foster carers. And then that's a required regular occurrence.
But it's quite broad.
Yeah, it's quite broad.
That's why it's easy to...
Yes. Yeah. So it allows then for an opportunity again for both the linked social worker and the foster carer to identify what supports are required in the placement, and that's not always happening because again the demands on social workers. But on the flip side of that leaves foster carers feeling very vulnerable and volatile. And then if they're dealing with a child with very complex behaviours and needs, and they're contending with that within their family unit all day, every day, without the associated supports, that can be very challenging for them, and that can in turn then contribute to placement breakdowns.
Yeah.
Just in terms of the areas where it's more acute than others, I suppose we're aware from meetings with the local area manager in the Carlow-Kilkenny area that there's a severe shortage of social workers in that geographical area, and whilst the local team are trying to their best efforts to ensure that services are delivered, but it's at a very thin level because they just the numbers of social workers are just not being recruited in some of those areas. Leishan Offaly was another area where they had recruited new social workers, but then also there was a movement, so the social workers have gone again.
So would they be the two black spots then, for want of a better phrase, Carlow, Kilkenny and Leishan Offaly?
Perhaps. I think, to our knowledge.
It ebbs and flows, really.
Yeah. And how are the inner city areas, the inner city Dublin or Limerick?
Dublin South Central, I think, as well, is an area that's under severe pressure. Again, there would be very high levels of children in care in that area. So I think what's happening is there are new social workers coming in, and then they're moving on very quickly. And that goes back to, I suppose, within our statement. It's really critical for a child in care to develop a very open and trusting relationship with the social worker who's overseeing their care. And so it's very important that a child, who can build up this relationship, that if they have anything that they might want to speak, that they're unhappy in their placement, that they have a named person with whom they've developed a relationship to disclose anything. Just in terms of then response from DCYA in terms of our submission under the review of the Childcare Act, that work is undergoing within DCYA at the moment, and IFCA will be speaking with the department. We work quite closely with the department. Yeah.
And the same then with the upskilling, rather than having to go back to full-time education. Has there been any conversation with the department as to how they might restructure the training?
That's part of our submission, because what we're really our submission to DCYA in respect of the review of the Childcare Act is very much looking at the concept of permanency for children in foster care, because there are many children who are in foster care for many years with families, and they may not require that same high level of social work support, allow the family more autonomy. And even if you look at the concept of enhanced rights for foster carers, that allows them to give consents for certain areas in the child's lives if the child has been with that foster carer for over 5 years. That then does not require the foster carer to contact a social worker to say, look, they're going on a school trip tomorrow, I need consent from you. That requires that social worker either to come out to the house and get consent, or the foster carer to go into the department and get consent. So they're very kind of regular, normalised things for children's lives. So the last thing anybody wants is for a child in care not to be able to go on the school trip because there wasn't anyone available to give them their consent. So I think maybe we should be looking at that whole area of enhanced rights for foster carers, that they can offer consent for certain types of the child's life, areas of the child's life, and that would have formed part of our submission to DCYA as well. Thank you.
Is that an absolute in terms of what consents can be provided by a foster carer, or is it a complete blanket that there are none, or are there some small things that can be done? Can be.
Under the Childcare Act, the social worker, as being the corporate parent of the child, offers all consents, and whether that's just a school outing or consent to go on holidays with the foster family. So there's a lot of red tape involved with that. So I think if we were to revisit the enhanced rights, which was part of the amendment of the Childcare Act in 2007, I think we should certainly would be it could be beneficial to revisit the Childcare Act in that respect, and where placements are stable, where children are doing well, and where they will be, that child will most likely be staying with that family for its entire life. And many of our members in IFCA would have children who came to them as babies, and they're with them now into adulthood and beyond, and they're not going anywhere. So it just regularises life for the child and for the family. Do you want to add?
Well, I suppose it's just anything that requires a signature is basically the answer to that you would have to refer to a social worker to get permission from them. So that is time consuming and can be very frustrating, both for social workers and foster carers in that relationship and in that dynamic. It's just a very, every day can become quite frustrating, I think, for both parties in that relationship. Just, yeah.
Okay. Deputy Chambers, sorry.
Yeah, that's my questions concluded. Thank you very much.
Okay. Deputy Sherlock, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here today, and this is certainly assisting us in trying to understand the dynamic that exists as between your organisation and the people you represent, and officialdom, if you will. Can I just ask, how would you characterise your relationship with TUSLA? Is it a positive relationship? Is it one in which you feel you're being listened to, and one in which you feel, in real terms, that the recommendations that you put forward are actually bearing some fruit?
I think the Irish Foster Care relationship, or Irish Foster Care Association, has a very good relationship with TUSLA. We meet with TUSLA at senior level, with the CEO at the time, and the Director of Operations, and we meet with TUSLA at local level as well. I think it's a constructive relationship where we can raise issues of concern, because that's what our organisation is there for, is to raise issues of concern of foster carers. But it's also a constructive relationship in respect that we seek to kind of find solutions together, because ultimately everybody is working in the best interest of children to ensure that foster care retains that really valuable status in our Irish society. We're quite unique in Ireland insofar as our children are in foster care.
Thank you. And just in relation to, say, you're outlining here of the fact, for instance, that foster carers don't have a link social worker. That to me suggests that there's a big gap there, because if there is the right, if you will, of the foster carer to have a social worker and the child to have a social worker, that is there the potential there for the element of risk to increase dramatically if that relationship between the carer and the child, deteriorates in any way? I suppose the suggestion, I would infer from that, I would conclude from that fact that, for instance, that of the 6,000 children or 5,000 plus who are in foster care arrangements, if we don't have an accurate figure of how many of those who are without a foster or a linked social worker, then there is the possibility or the potential for the risk of some of those relationships to be in a state of disrepair or deteriorated as we speak here today, and we might not know that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think the optimum is that the linked social worker is an allocated social worker to the foster carer. As we stand today, foster carers have access to a person, a social worker, that there isn't any gap. That they have access to a number within TUSLA that they can contact if they have a concern. Foster carers generally use the Irish Foster Carers Helpline quite frequently, and if they have a problem they will resort to our helpline, and we will put them in contact with the most appropriate person. But I mean, foster carers are assured there is somebody to call, but it's about the relationship issue that's really important.
Okay, so and if I understand that correctly, so like in the absence of because the theme here is recruitment and retention. So, and if we're trying to plug that gap, so to speak, the risk is offset by the fact that if there is the absence of a social worker for a particular family, both for the child and for the foster carer, if issues arise, there is, in place of that gap, a mechanism for the parent, if you will, foster parent, carer, to contact an organisation like your own or the helpline. Does such a facility then exist, say, for instance, where if a child is at risk potentially, that they have some recourse? Or we see, we assume that the relationship is benign and positive, and I think we all absolutely concur with you in respect of, you know, the good work that is done by people who care for children in a fostering arrangement. But then we have to have regard to the fact that if there's a shortage of social workers, that the risk profile increases such that child protection issues become even more prevalent. If you're telling us that there are 5,000 who are in foster care arrangements, and if not all of those, and we don't have exact figures, no more probably than yourselves have exact figures, that there is a gap, a major gap in the service there, such that the risk to children is potentially increased. That's just an impression I have. Perhaps you can disavow me of that impression that I have.
I think there's
or help me to understand.
Yeah, I think there is obviously a natural risk there in the absence of having an allocated social worker to any case. I would also say that if there has been a break in when a foster care, for example, hasn't had a social worker for some time, and then they are allocated a social worker, that can take time for a relationship to build, and there can have been decisions made during that period where there was an absence of a social worker, and this new social worker might have to backtrack and sort of fix some of those decisions. And that can be.
But if I understand you correctly, like for example, just to quote, some foster carers do not have a linked social worker, and the impact of this is that they do not have access to supports as required. So if I interpret that correctly, what you're actually saying is that there are gaps out there. I mean, do you have a numerical analysis of what the gaps are in terms of the number of children who are without a linked social worker at present, for instance?
Okay, well, a lot of people would, well, they may not have an allocated social worker. They will have access to a team leader on a team, so they will always be able to contact somebody in Tusla.
Okay.
But they may not have access to their social worker, so to speak. But they will have access to a team leader or a principal social worker in that area that they will be able to access information and get guidance from. So it's not that they will be without any contact. They will always have a contact with somebody.
Okay, so there is nobody in the system that is literally cast adrift.
That I would. No,
I know you can.
I can't really say, but no, that's not. They couldn't be really. They're in the system. They're on a panel. They're governed by the foster care committee.
Okay.
There's a principal social worker. There's a team leader. There should be somebody there to support them at some capacity.
And when the decision, and again, just to help me, this is all about developing our understanding of the dynamics that exist. The foster care committee that is comprised of who exactly?
A number of professionals are comprised on the foster care committee. It's quite prescriptive. The foster care committee guidelines is quite prescriptive. So you would have like an area medical officer, psychologist, principal social worker, and a range of other professionals. And it's quite onerous. Foster carers sit on the committee as well. So it's quite an onerous body to put oneself before to be approved as a foster carer.
Okay. Well, can I just put it to you then as well, just in relation to recruitment and retention, that the former deputy of this House, former deputy Pat Rabbitte, is now chair of TUSLA. He was before us some weeks ago. He spoke about the recruitment and retention of social workers as a key thematic area that he wanted to articulate views on. And he also made the point in parallel with yourselves here today in respect of we'll say upskilling or bridging type education so that you can upskill social care staff. I would love to have a greater understanding of why we haven't, if people have identified this as an issue and it's ongoing for quite a number of years, why is it that the Irish system hasn't bridged that gap so that, for instance, social care staff, instead of going back into full-time education, can't do an upskilling course or a bridging course or a postgraduate course that would see them, suitably qualified? Like, what is your perception of the gaps there, or what is your perception of why that hasn't happened?
I suppose, look, to train and qualify as a social worker is a it's a rigorous process. It requires a lot. people will have gone through their social care degree, and they will have a certain training and level, and they'll have a certain perspective on their training. Social work is a different profession than social care, but there should be, and there could be, I think, a practical way to solve that by some sort of mechanism that you described there, supporting people who are qualified as social workers. They have to, or social care workers have a degree, and there's some mechanism there to bring them into the other profession in a more streamlined way than having to go back and do, maybe the full-time 2-year master's degree that's required of them at the moment.
And your suggestion is that bursaries perhaps could be provided by TUSLA?
I think if you're talking about retention, recruitment and retention, I think that could be, because university, if you go back to university and you've already had an undergraduate degree and the government has already funded that degree, you are going to incur costs to do that. I just think it's trying to be creative and see what could be possible, and I think certainly that could be attractive to people. But then I think on the flip side of that, they would have to sign up to being with TUSLA for a period of time if they're in receipt of that kind of bursary, and that would assure then the retention of those staff into the future with TUSLA.
Okay. And last question, Chair. My train of thought has just left me. I just wanted to ask about the demand for foster care places is increasing, obviously, because the figure of 6,000, or sorry, well, it's 6,000 approximately in care and 5,000 approximately in foster care. How do you encourage people to become foster carers or foster parents, to use that expression? Where is the gap there, and why is it that more people aren't taking up that challenge, if you will?
Well, I think the Irish Foster Care Association, we've just concluded Fostering Fortnight, which ran from the 4th of March to the 15th of March. And that was a 2-week series of promotion of foster care and the benefits of being in foster care. And in parallel to that, we run an annual survey. We ask foster carers what attracts you to being in foster care, or what do you think what do you offer as being a foster carer. And the majority of foster carers would say, if you want to become a foster carer, talk to another foster carer. That's the best way to get information, and then to do your own research, and that's what our survey showed. But what we really need to do is to ensure that we retain our current foster carers, as well as creating the environment for foster carers to enter into becoming foster carers, and that comes back to the importance of supports for foster carers, and that's it's really critical that when somebody says, I have a child with very complex needs, the placement is getting very stressed, we're all very stressed in the household, that somebody's there to respond and de-escalate that situation, and then if somebody has the supports that are required, they will stick with the task.
And would you, very last question, would you characterise then the relationship or the challenges that foster carers face at the moment as being extremely difficult in the main, or in intermittently? The perception I have is that if you're a foster carer, the placement can be quite difficult. If you don't have supports, you're fighting. So presumably foster carers are constantly fighting with HSE TUSLA for additional services.
Yes, that would be the fact for some foster carers, and our National Support Helpline, which took over 900 calls last year from foster carers, are generally seeking help. As I would always say, people don't generally ring our helpline to say things are fantastic and life's great. They call when they're experiencing a difficulty or require assistance and supports, and that's the objective of our helpline. And we have national advocates, part-time national advocates who can go and help, meet with foster carers, and national support volunteer advocates as well, who can support volunteers or support our foster carers. So I suppose what we're really trying to do is maybe it's prevention is always the best cure. So if the supports are there, and foster carers are feeling held and supported and have the necessary tools to do the job that they're tasked to do, then that's only a good news story for foster care then.
And I think just to add to that, Ireland is a small country, and word of mouth is a huge factor in terms of fostering communities in local branches and hubs around Ireland. So if people are experiencing difficulties in these areas, there's going to be a natural spill into the community as to how positively they regard that role. So I think that needs to be.
Thank you, Deputy Sherlock. Is there, perhaps it might be useful for the members to be provided with a brief overview of the sort of calls or the nature of the calls that might be received by that helpline from foster carers?
Sure. I suppose we provide an annual report in terms of the nature of the calls, and we can provide then different breakdowns of different counties where issues are quite prevalent. The vast majority of calls are around how do I become a foster carer, but that used to be the nature of the calls. That is decreasing now. We get a number of calls from foster carers, and I suppose the predominant ones would be an allegation has been made against a foster carer, and that they've just received the news that an allegation of some kind of an allegation has been made against them, and they're really just very distressed, and they pick up the phone, and I might pass this on to Andrew, because Andrew would be somebody who's actually dealing at the coalface with this.
So there would be three, or there would have been three over the last, I worked in the last 3 years, and there would be three areas that are particularly prevalent. Would have been allegations, access, difficulties with access, demands placed on foster carers, difficulties around arrangements, all of that kind of stuff, and aftercare. We've actually come a long way in relation to dealing with the aftercare issue. There's a national rolled out standardised process around that, which has worked really, really well. But underlying all of the issues, I would suggest to you that it is a communication issue with working with TUSLA, the demands are placed on foster carers in terms of understanding the limits of their role, wanting to be able to be parents to these children, being able to enjoy family life, being able to provide these children with normal experiences. And sometimes that goes wrong, sometimes things don't go to plan, and that can be reported on or understood in a different way, and there can be difficulties in trying to work all of that out and for everybody to come to an understanding of the situation. And the relationships can be eroded during those times of conflict in trying to work out, particularly in relation to allegations. If a child has a perception that they were mistreated, a foster carer might have a totally different understanding of what happened, but that child might have to be removed for their own safety, and that placement might naturally have to end at that point. So there's lots of it's very complicated, and it's convoluted situation. Yeah.
Sorry, may I just,
yes, please, go ahead.
In terms of access, I just referred earlier on that where there's new infants, and obviously the desire is always a new infant would go home to the natural parent, and all attempts are made for that to ensure that happens. However, if there is a requirement for the foster carer to attend access 4, 5, 6 times a week, their own family suffers then, and their own children don't get to go to their soccer practice or their dance practice. So I think what we must remember is that foster care is taking place in a family home. It's not an institution, it's a family home, and it's around the demands of the foster carer then to be realistic, that they are providing care to a child, but it's within the context of a family home.
Okay. Just 2 additional questions before I provide time to Deputy Mitchell. The 6,000 children in care of foster carers in the state, or thereabouts, would you have any figures or any idea as to how we might compare with some of our near neighbours in terms of the prevalence of foster care as a support for children growing up in environments inappropriate to a successful upbringing, if there is such a thing, and based on our population, is there some comparative?
We compare very favourably in Europe, not just with our near neighbours, but within the European context. Okay. We would have the highest amount of children growing up in family care as opposed to institutional care or other type of care. So that's what the Irish foster care would always say. Foster care is the jewel in the crown for children in care in the Irish state, and it's an area that needs to be protected and supported and invested in.
What's your view on agency staff, agency social workers within TUSLA that might be working with your families across the country? I think it's 1,300 foster families you represent, is that correct?
Yes, 2,000.
2,000,
yeah.
Sorry, even more.
Well, I suppose that there's a need for social workers, and if there is no social workers, there's a need for other types of social workers, and everyone has had the same level of training. So it's just regardless of who their employer is. But
Do you see any difference, practically?
I think, well, if agency is not as permanent, I think the idea around children in care is that we have as much a permanent situation as possible. Children are in families, that family is permanent, that the people who are supporting that family have a permanency around them. Obviously, people have to move on and change, but at the level of change at the minute, it seems for a lot of families it's a lot to absorb in terms of different styles, different personalities, all of that kind of stuff. So I think if agency is being used, I think there's invariably going to be a tendency for agency staff to move on quicker than permanent staff in an agency. So there is, getting back to a level of risk, I think, in employing agency over permanent staff.
It's not the optimum, but at the same time it's providing a stopgap. However, foster carers would routinely say, I have to go back to the beginning and tell the story all over again. And children in care would say the same. And it's not fair to be asking children in care to keep rehashing the reasons why they're in care.
Just as a matter of interest, would you be aware of, in a foster care child's life, just arbitrarily, if a child is referred and provided to a foster family, and that child is reared by that foster family, how many, on average, to your knowledge, how many social workers would that foster care or indeed child go through in over, I don't know, maybe, I'm not sure what the average stay would be, but we'll just say 10 years for argument's sake. I mean, how many times is that child and that family going to have to retell the story in the normal course of affairs?
I suppose I can't really say, but I would say that there are people have said that they've dealt within 1 year. To say if I'd had a support call, that they've dealt with 4 different social workers within 1 year. So
problematic.
That might be just an outlier, and we have to accept that there are outliers in every situation. But that is obviously for that child and that family, that's not going to be necessarily a good working relationship.
And then in terms of my last one, Deputy Mitchell, my last question then is in relation to the regional disparity that you touched upon in your opening statement. In terms of recruitment and retention, there are some black spots which I think you mentioned went under questioning from Deputy Chambers. And I suppose one area that would be a very great concern to me would be the inner city, particularly in Dublin. I mean, have we seen a rise in the number of gaps in the system in terms of children not being allocated a social worker or foster families not being allocated a social worker as a result? Or is it plateauing? I appreciate there is a deficiency in the service, and that goes without saying. There aren't enough social workers, we know that. Part of the role of this committee is to determine how we get more into the system based on the output. And the output, unfortunately, is insufficient. So, we have to be creative, and that's why your input to this is so important to us. But maybe you might try and provide some further information on that, please.
I think certainly there are those black spots that we mentioned. Like, they had full complement of social workers and then it reduced back again. So certainly anecdotal evidence from foster carers is that one particular area didn't have any social workers for a while. Then they got this great, wonderful team. Things were going really well. Everyone was delighted. And then very quickly those social workers left again. So I think it goes back to maybe getting under the rationale why people are leaving, and that's why exit interviews are really important, even if they can be done anonymously on a portal or online or something. Just because we need to know why people are taking up jobs and then why they're leaving jobs, and until we have that data, we won't really know how we can assist in retaining social workers.
And the decision to move any job, I'm sure, it starts at least, 6 months to a year before you start to move. So there's probably a cohort there who are contemplating leaving or wondering about their future. So it would be worth, I think, doing something like that to capture that and to try and prevent that from happening.
And perhaps maybe just a small piece of research, even just like directly with social workers, focus groups or something that might elicit that information, or people who have left could maybe contribute to that as well.
It certainly would be very beneficial, I think, to the whole system if that were to occur. But thank you very much. Deputy Mitchell, please.
Thanks very much for your presentation. I just want to ask you just a few brief questions because a lot of stuff was touched on here. You say that you have 2,036 members, right? So I just want to ask you, how do foster carers become a member? What are they aware of your organisation? And because I see the fact that there's 4,523 foster carers, so you're half and half. So you can just address that first.
Sure. I suppose the Irish Foster Care Association, we have our membership. It's kind of, people can join up online, but it's very important when either at a foster care committee, when somebody has just been approved and it's a wonderful day, you've been approved as a foster carer, that the information is disseminated by the committee to a new foster carer to say this is your support organisation who can assist and support you as a foster carer. We achieve membership through like promotions, say Fostering Fortnight, through various campaigns that we would run. But also we have been in discussion with TUSLA to look to see how more foster carers, new foster carers, can become members of IFCA, because IFCA offers an insurance policy to foster carers which protects them in the event of any allegation being made against them. It offers them legal protection. So it's very essential that foster carers would become members of IFCA. But it's always a challenge to seek and promote and get new members in, but that's one of our key objectives.
Okay.
Private foster care agencies, they would automatically take up membership for the foster carers with us.
Private agencies,
do. They automatically do.
But it's not mandatory with TUSLA. TUSLA doesn't assign any foster carer up to the...
Our membership fees are very, very minimal. So, I mean, that could be something that could be looked at, that foster carers would be... It comes back to that appreciation of the task that you're doing. That you would automatically be signed up as a member, and certainly that is something that we've discussed, but it's certainly something we'd like to see.
And when you discussed it with TUSLA, what response did they give you?
Well, there's an openness to seeing how we can achieve it.
Okay.
So we will continue to work with them, but a very simple solution might just be that the membership is paid for any new foster carer, that as part of your new foster carer pack, that you get membership to IFCA.
And many foster carers would call us eventually, non-members. We take calls from non-members, and they would call us, and they would say, we didn't know you existed, we didn't know you were there, and they find that we're able to then be able to assist them then after that, and they might join us then. Yeah.
And just on the calls that you take in, right, so there's a helpline. What hours is it?
It comes Monday to Friday from 11 to 3.
11 to 3, Monday to Friday.
Yeah.
And just on the subject that we're on, how many calls would you take in that actually relate to people without a social worker, a child without a social worker, or a carer without a link worker?
I'd have to come back to you. I don't have those.
Would you be able to, if you could get
them
that,
for you.
we'd appreciate that.
Yeah.
Because I think there's no doubt that we have got a recruitment crisis, but I think that it's important that we acknowledge the hard work that social workers actually do.
Absolutely.
Because I would have a personal experience of this, but like social workers are, in my eyes, are amazing because they're not only the child social worker, they also become their best friend. You know what I mean? And they're the children turn to the age, exactly what you said, but it's not only just with placement, it's every aspect of their life. So I think that it's important that we actually hold staff. You spoke there about families with turning in, like I know young children who are fairly young who went through about 8 different social workers and the impact that has. So this is where I'm coming to. Why are we losing this great sort, fantastic people in TUSLA? Why are they walking away? Is it down to the workload, the stress of the jobs? Like you're talking here, you said, for instance, that you reckon that there could be up to 30 cases per social worker. So am I right in saying that, like, this social worker could be doing access, with the children, plus arranging all the children's needs if the child does need therapeutic, and could be one placement where there could be 4 children that this social worker is looking after, plus her other 29 cases.
No, well, I suppose it's really important to note that 30 cases is an indicative number, that would obviously have to go back to TUSLA to clarify that. However, you are correct insofar as, like, for every child in foster care, and every foster carer who's parenting a child in foster care, that foster carer themselves would have to have their foster care reviews, their support and supervision, information about access. That social worker may need to go to court on a number of occasions for that child. And that's why I thought it was really important to outline very specifically about the roles and responsibilities required of both the linked social worker and the child in care and social worker, because the task is enormous, and really we do need to support our social workers doing this very serious and important job, and whatever supports they can be offered to allow them to do that job to the best of their ability, retain our foster carers, support our children in care, because it's incumbent on everybody to make sure we get, to retain what we have at the moment.
Do you think that there could be a role for foster carers themselves? Because when we come to review stages, for example, like, there's a lot of work that a social worker has to do when the reviews, and in some cases in voluntary care orders, these reviews can be twice, 3 times a year, depending. So I'm just wondering, is there a role itself for foster carers? Because sometimes foster carers feel that some of this can be box ticking and they have no responsibility in it. So say, for instance, when the Garda Fettin is coming around, is there a way that we can give responsibility to foster carers to have these things in place themselves? You know what I mean? That, when your car is due an NCT, you get your text message to say you're due your NCT. So is there a way that the foster carers itself could be helped, lifting workloads by doing this stuff themselves?
Well, I think first and foremost, foster carers have a very onerous task as they have at the moment, so I really wouldn't be requesting that any more layers be put onto them. But certainly in terms of preparation for foster care reviews, IFCA would advocate for and support foster carers to prepare themselves in terms of what they bring to the review, and we have offered training to foster carers in this respect of late, and we will continue to do that, and that's very much around the foster carer coming into the foster care reviews place, very informed, very knowledgeable, identifying their continuing professional development, identifying issues in the foster care placement, but also bringing solutions to that. So it is a process of it's a two-way relationship in terms of that review. It's a two-way process in terms of that process themselves, rather than just a tick-boxing exercise. And in respect of Garda vetting, the person who's charged with doing the vetting has to provide the links to the vetting service. So somebody's going to have to push that button, in other words, for the foster care to respond to that.
Okay, and in around, you spoke there about the strains on foster parents in around access and stuff. So I'm just wondering, do you would you get many calls in from foster parents with that concern? That access has increased, that sometimes that and this also, I believe, affects social workers as well, because if it's a supervised situation, we need then to have staff to do this supervised situation. So things can vary. Originally, when a placement would start, it would probably just be in access with one family member, and then down the line. So I'm just wondering, is that an issue that you see happening, getting calls in on it, and plus then it actually puts a strain as well on the
access is one of the higher level of difficulties that we experience on the helpline. Some children have sibling access, they have they have grandparent access, they have lots of different accesses in meetings to attend, and social workers will have to coordinate that, foster carers will have to respond to that, they have their own lives to sort of to work around all of that, and it can be definitely very, very problematic, especially if it's court ordered and it's increased and there's nobody can, it has to be adhered to. So there's obviously going to be strains placed on every party in that relationship in trying to achieve that for the child. Access can be emotionally difficult for children. They can have behavioural problems before and after access visits. That can be a huge strain on everybody involved, and emotional labour of that can be very difficult. And I think that sometimes we don't take enough account of that the emotional labour that's involved and everybody involved in those dynamics for children, it can be very, very stressful.
No, well, I'm just saying, like, it is important. I'm not taking from the fact that children need to have access, but I'm just concerned then that every access, the social worker has to put a report in. Would that be correct? So,
Yes, yeah.
that's
And
that
be in attendance as well.
in attendance, and then that social worker could have 4 accesses
And
for
then
different cases.
write that report up. One other aspect of access is because of the placement of children geographically, maybe some distance away from their family of origin, that's certainly putting a huge strain on foster carers, because they're, you know, putting up substantial mileage to get from A to B on any given day, particularly if children are placed outside of their kind of their community, and that certainly has introduced a higher demand of access then of both social workers and foster carers again.
Thank you. Deputy Mitchell. Senator Warfield, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the really informative submission and the questions and answering the questions as well. Last year I was driving in, it must have been around this time of the year, I was driving into Leicester House and it must have been Fostering Fortnight that you just mentioned, because there was an interview on Seán Sherlock with a couple who had fostered many, many times and went on to adopt as well. But it kind of raised it in my consciousness as something to be explored later in life. It was such a powerful piece. Everybody needs recognition and acknowledgement, and one of my other areas in policy is the arts, and artists continually go ignored and unrewarded. How can we give greater recognition to social workers and greater acknowledgement to social workers?
I think maybe, I think everybody in any job that you do, you need recognition and support, and I think it is through, first of all, recognition and appreciation of the work that you do. It's really important, and I think sometimes some of there can be negative, maybe, comments made about social work or social work staff. So I think even just changing the narrative into a positive narrative could be very helpful. And then it's there are great. There is great work being done within TUSLA itself in terms of supporting the staff, having research and development functions, having portals where staff can link in to get more information, and peer support groups themselves. But I think it always comes back to, first of all, that I suppose the society recognises the value that somebody brings to whatever walk of life they do, and then your employer recognises it, and that has employment recognition can take shape in many forms, whether that's remuneration, working terms and conditions. But I think it's very much around changing the narrative, maybe initially.
Yeah, because we respect GPs and we respect.
Yes.
We see in the nurses the powerful public support for nurses, but maybe the public support is not so high profile. You mentioned terms and conditions and pay. Is pay and salary? I
wouldn't really be able to answer to that. I mean, I think that's part of the public service pay level agreement. So that's really, but certainly, I think it's very much around, as you mentioned yourself there, Deputy. It's around the public recognition, and sometimes, social workers working in different fields. So you can have medical social workers, and they're working with families when at times of great distress or illness, or but then you have kind of children in care and child protection social work. So that can be very complex, and social workers may be, working with families to protect the children, and that can be removing the child from the family. So that can be quite contentious.
Yeah.
And I think that, social work it's therapeutically orientated practice. I think that we've probably forgotten that along the way a lot of the time, that it's very administrative, it's legalistic, it's all of those sort of cross-straddling all of those forums. And I think ultimately, as a social worker, you work in the area of human rights of children. It should be valued for that. And I think that there needs to be an awareness, general awareness of what their actual role is, and it is definitely more. It should be, and it's a practice. It's a therapeutic endeavour that they try to achieve.
Yeah. I suppose I ask this because there's a role for all of us to play. We occupy public spaces when we're talking about speeches or writing speeches and making contributions that we we recognise those positive effects. I think you've answered this already around a shortage, whether there's a shortage of prospective foster carers. But do you think the issue of social workers' retention, the issues that surround that, affects the number of foster carers who would consider the option of foster care?
I think, as we said earlier on, we absolutely know the number one, I suppose, attraction for somebody to think about becoming a foster carer is definitely talking to another foster carer and hearing of their experiences. So if somebody's hearing of negative experiences, it's not going to be quite attractive. Yeah. There's always a need for foster carers because there's always children coming into care. And there is an acute shortage, of foster carers at the moment, because there are foster carers who are retiring and they're not being replenished at kind of the back end. So I think, as I said earlier on, foster care is very unique position in Ireland. It's foster carers play a fantastic and a superb role in our society and what they offer.
Do you say that it's unique in Ireland because it's a alternative to institutional care?
Yeah, I think you study the kind of the journey of, I suppose, the Irish state and institutional care, and the learnings from institutional care, and then we had small residential care homes, and then there was learnings from that, and I suppose everybody knows for a child to grow up in a family is the optimum for any child, to have regular, normal family life. And that's what foster care is offering to all of our 6,000 children who are growing up today in foster care. I think the Irish Foster Care Association, we have a national annual conference every autumn, and at that conference the foster carers and all the children come to that conference, and it's the best sight in the world to see all of the children, the birth children, the foster carers, the families all together, and everybody having a really good time, and seeing these children in foster care who are doing so well, and even the ones who are not doing so well, but they're so cared for and so loved. It's really do anyone's heart good to see it.
Where was I? I had a question just on the from your statement. You front-loaded information about the Irish Penal Reform Trust, that children in foster care aren't involved in juvenile justice. With respect, was there a reason why you front-loaded that information? I would have no expectation that children in foster care would be involved in the juvenile justice system, or perhaps it's kind of a redundant stereotype that you're trying to...
Well, I think it's just that report is literally was just released 3 weeks ago, and it's the first time that kind of study has been done, looking at the cohorts of children who are in the juvenile justice system, and the Irish Foster Care Association assisted in the research by providing access to foster carers. Now, I think just maybe there's a requirement, and perhaps maybe to strip that report back a little bit more, as to maybe are there children who are actually presenting with high levels of difficulties in placements, or maybe levels of aggression, but that foster carers are very resilient and robust, and they're less likely to maybe report this to anybody. But I think it's another good outcome, and it's a measured outcome for children in foster care, and any new piece of research that indicates the positive aspect of family home care for children is just another testament to the benefit and value of it.
As opposed to young people who are leaving residential care, there was a much higher proportion. There was a criminal justice contact for children who are leaving, or young people leaving residential care, as opposed to foster care. Now, look, you could look at that, and the transition for young people leaving foster care, they have a longer transition period. They might get aftercare, and therefore they might have that experience at a later time in their life. We have to, again, I think research around that might need to be is needed.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
What is there an aim in terms of recruitment of staffing numbers for the entire system to be fit for purpose? Is there an aim for staffing numbers? Like, what numbers of staff should we be aiming for in terms of social workers?
You might have to refer that one back to Tusla.
Okay, I will do. And just on the enhanced rights for carers, then, I appreciate, like, everyday issues like school tours probably shouldn't be a problem. How much notice would a foster carer have to give to a social worker to get consent for a school trip, for example?
It's very dependent on when when the school asks. I mean, we couldn't. It depends.
Yeah.
Really,
I mean,
truly.
just to know that many parents, I think, would attest to the fact that they find these notes at the school bag at the evening time when they're looking for something else, and then they discover there's a school tour happening on Friday, and then there's a dash on then to get the consent signed by the social worker, and that social worker is in court for 3 days, and they know the foster care is looking for them, and the foster care continues to look for them, but they're tied up doing other things. There can be the risk then that the child doesn't get the consent and the child doesn't go, and that's not what we want, and that's why enhanced rights for foster carers would be really extremely important. And
I can see an issue around medical consent being a step too far, or
I think it just warrants a discussion, and that's certainly part of IFCA's submission to the Department of Children and Youth Affairs in the review of the Child Care Act. It's timely now that we kind of open up these discussions again.
that was my follow-on from that.
And it would always be related to the care order that the child is in place. So the voluntary care order, interim care order, full care order, and that will dictate the level and the foster carer's capacity to be able to make a decision around those issues as well. So it's more nuanced than that.
It would require legislative change. You mentioned the Act.
Yes.
That's it, Sinead. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you very much, Senator Warfield. I'd like to thank you very much for coming before us this morning and for answering members' questions so fulsomely. We will suspend for a few minutes then to allow our next witnesses to take their seats. But thank you again. Thank you very much. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome the Irish Association of Social Workers, Ms. Áine McGurk, Chairperson of the Irish Association of Social Workers, and Mr. Joe McCarthy. You're both very welcome this morning, and thank you very much for making yourselves available to us. I'd like to welcome members again, and also viewers who may be watching our proceedings on Oireachtas TV, to the public session of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Children and Youth Affairs. Before we commence, in accordance with procedure, I'm required to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that the evidence given in connection with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not make charges, should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity in a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. And members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise nor make charges against a person outside the House or in a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. I would like to remind members and witnesses, and indeed members in the public gallery, to please switch off your mobile phone, as it may interfere with the recording systems and prevent parliamentary reporters from fulfilling their task, and it also has a habit of interfering with the broadcasting of the committee. I also wish to advise you that any submission or opening statements you've made to the committee will be published on the committee website after this meeting, and after your presentation there will of course be engagement from the members. So I'd now like to call on Ms. Áine McGurk to make your opening statement, please.
Thank you. Chairman, Deputies and Senators, we're delighted to appear before your committee today and hope that the IASW can be of assistance to you in your deliberations on the issue of recruitment and retention in TUSLA. I'm Áine McGurk, Chair of the Irish Association of Social Workers, and with me today is Joe McCarthy, one of our members of long standing, who has much experience in this area. I've kept this statement to 5 minutes so that we can maybe explore things in questions. Therefore, it's quite short, because I discovered 5 minutes is quite short when you time yourself. Social workers employed in the area of child protection and welfare practice their skills in a high-risk environment where there are no perfect solutions and where their efforts are rarely recognised or acknowledged. The nature of social work is dealing with risk, making the best professional judgment they can when they assess a child's situation to be good enough for them to close the door and move on to the next child's story. These are incredible professionals, and we must consider how we can promote a positive view of the work they do for children and families in crisis. Social workers bring a range of skills to their work as they help clients negotiate the difficult and complex systems of Irish society in the 21st century. Families never complain when they've been waiting for a while for TUSLA to come and complete an assessment of a child welfare concern. These are largely silent, involuntary clients in an imperfect world, and the social worker's skill is in facilitating the family or child to achieve good outcomes, often against impossible odds. Social workers need to be properly supported to do this difficult work and to be acknowledged by society rather than being constantly blamed. Social workers champion the development of child protection services. It was social workers who began to respond to child abuse in the 1970s, beginning the process for a slow uncovering of a difficult and shameful past over the next decades. The profession needs to attract the best to take on this work. It needs to be carried out to the highest standards. Social workers need to be bright, well-educated, resilient, enthusiastic professionals with the drive for social justice and ethical practice. Consider if you would encourage your child to pursue this career, and if not, why. In the ISW, we have been concerned about the recruitment and retention issues in TUSLA for some time. We meet with Jim Gibson, Chief Operations Officer, and Colette Walsh, our Director. We see no evidence of a national recruitment campaign, and potential candidates must go to the TUSLA website to see if there are vacancies. While recruitment is certainly a significant issue, leading to an overuse of expensive agency staff and presents as a significant issue nationally, retention may in fact be the more significant problem. Just qualified staff are quickly dealing with complex child welfare and protection cases, complicated legal proceedings, and making life-changing decisions for children and families. To support staff, we must also retain and post team leaders and principal social workers who provide essential leadership in the provision of frontline services to children and families. While all social work has stresses, children and families is recognised as the most difficult work. These social workers exercise a statutory role, including the taking of proceedings under the Childcare Act 91, and ensure the operation of state regulations with regard to children in care. The provision of care to children and families is complex, with high demands from the law, the court and its agents. The social worker appears as applicant in the court for TUSLA. Here, their professional actions and opinion are subjected to the highest scrutiny in a different way to other professionals who appear in the case as either agents of the court or professional witnesses. This can be extremely difficult and stressful for inexperienced social workers who are just doing their best to provide a professional service to the child who is the subject of the proceedings. The work of TUSLA comes under the scrutiny of HICWA, who spoke to your committee last month on this issue. The child and family sector is now the most regulated, inspected and audited area of social work. While regulation is necessary and useful in ensuring compliance with agreed standards, this scrutiny is grounds for further stresses, placing an emphasis on paperwork as evidence of work done rather than on the practice of social work. The attendant negative attention from the media long after the inspection causes further stresses for perhaps already demoralised staff who work well beyond a standard working week to deal with the families on their caseload. In 2019, social problems are more complex and acute than ever and are more plentiful and concentrated in large urban centres. Abuse, ill-treatment and neglect are found across all communities, and these situations are characterised by secrecy, emotional isolation, neediness, stress and lack of respect, often hidden under a cloak of normalcy. Social workers become very skilled in working with this kind of family, but they require time and guidance to develop such competencies. Addiction, poor educational outcomes, abuse, unemployment, mental and physical health problems, intellectual disability, homelessness and injustice are the backdrop to the day-to-day work of a social worker. Today, drugs are available countrywide with its attendant social problems, deprivation and marginalisation. If you walk up Merchants Quay, Dublin, or see a wet, dirty sleeping bag filled with a sleeper in a doorway, you may well be looking at the face of a parent of a child in care, or perhaps an adult that was raised in state care. These realities are a construction of society, not social work. TUSLA social workers deal with people in their homes and communities. Some communities have become hostile places, increasing the risks associated with home visiting. Violence as a solution has become more commonplace, and guns and other weaponry are the tools of the drug dealer. TUSLA social workers must deal with these families in all these environments, including areas that other services sometimes refuse to enter. Today, in some social work offices, there is security at the door, restricted entry to their buildings, and meeting rooms monitored by CCTV. As a result, the social worker draws on all their professional knowledge and training to deal with these families in an empathetic, supportive and helpful way. I am increasingly struck by the capacity of these young professionals to build relationships with individuals and families in this context and give children a chance at a better life, either with their parents or in the care of foster or residential carers. Fresh from college, the young graduate may be facing an inevitable future. Work for TUSLA for a couple of years, because that's where the jobs are, to get experience, and then move on to an agency where work is less high risk, where clients are happy to engage, where hours of attendance are predictable and conducive to a better work-life balance, and where public opinion is more positive. Or work for a couple of years to earn enough money to travel and consider the future from faraway, sunnier climes. TUSLA must work hard to become an employer of choice, where the benefits of staying outweigh the stresses of the work. We understand this is a difficult issue to solve quickly. We have made suggestions in our full submission, which the members all received, and we will be happy to address them now and answer any other questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGurk. Appreciate your opening statement. I'll take it in reverse order if other members are willing. So, Senator Warfield, that would put you first, if you wish.
No, I have to run. Sorry.
You're okay. Okay. Well, then, Deputy Sherlock has indicated. So, Deputy Sherlock, please.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank you sincerely for being here today, because I think your submission, the 5 minutes doesn't do justice, if you will, to the wider submission that you've given to us. So I want to thank you sincerely for that, because I think what you've done here is articulated for me personally a way forward for for us as a committee in respect of dealing with the issues of recruitment and retention. So I want to thank you sincerely for that. I also want to thank you for defending your colleagues, because we do live in times where it is very easy to beat up on the social worker, and the social worker then, you know, in a judicial setting, in a societal setting, can be seen as the easy target for public opprobrium. And while there have been cases in the recent past and historically in relation to maybe the quality of engagement of social workers, that is certainly the exception and not the norm. And I have an appreciation now, on the basis of your submission today, and just generally speaking in relation to our deliberations on this very issue of recruitment and retention, that it's the hidden work, the work that is undocumented, you know, that is the quality you know, of the engagement, that you can't put a HICWA stamp on or tick a box for, the relationship building, that is vital to sustaining the very system that we have. So I just want to firstly to thank you for your attendance here today, and to thank you for, you know, this very important submission, because I think we have something, Chair, with which we can really work on and get our hands dirty on, so to speak, you know, roll up our sleeves on. I want to be educated, if you will, in the day-to-day understanding of the role of the social worker. And my first question really is in relation to the, say for instance, if you're talking about the child protection and welfare of children. If a case comes in the front door of TUSLA or any other agency, to get a better understanding of how that case is triaged, if you will, how is it dealt with by how does it land on the social worker's desk? So if you're talking about specific, we've had a very good interaction in relation to foster care, but in relation to child protection, if one is a social worker, how does the case land on that person's desk? And typically then, if you can articulate for me, if that case has to become the subject of a care order, can you highlight for us what the social worker has to go through, and where the social worker is on the pecking order in respect of the legal framework around that? So, for instance, if a social worker has to go to court, for instance, from it landing on the desk, front of house, to maybe going to a care order, what does a typical social worker have to do? How much paperwork does that person have to do? How much of, you know, and afterwards, once the care order is successfully applied for, what is the contact time versus the administrative time? Can you break down for us, for instance, like, is it a 50-50 paperwork contact time? Is it an 80-20? Is it possible to even, you know, is the social worker now having to do a lot more administrative work and a lot less contact time? And is that, within the existing cohort of social workers, also having a bearing on outcomes for the relationship between the social worker and the child? And also, you know, is it contributing to a malaise or a how would I put it to you, a set of circumstances where a social worker just after a couple of years faces burnout and says, I'm off, I can't deal with this anymore. You know, how can we change the nature of the relationships in such a way that we have a larger quotient of social workers, that the workload is manageable, that it becomes family friendly for the social worker, because it's a female dominated profession. That's a statement of fact. You know, and for women in particular who will have families inevitably, you know, what kind of arrangements are put in place for, you know, for a female social worker who wants to, you know, continue in her profession, wants to have the requisite time off, and to be working within hours then that meet the needs of her own family, and also, you know, allows her to continue on professionally and to attain, you know, progress within her career and so on. So I'm offloading a load of issues to you there, but I think I'm trying to create I have a picture in my own mind. I think you'll be able to crystallise what I'm saying down into, you know, you'll be able to present a picture for us, I feel, that will, help us to, deal with the issues of recruitment, retention, because those are the two key words in effect. And if you can present or paint a picture for us of some of the points that I'm outlining, I think that will be very useful for us.
Lots of questions.
Yes, lots of questions there in relation to the whole kind of process when something comes in from referral to maybe a child becoming a child who is in the care of the state. That now is dealt with at several levels. So we now have intake teams who triage it. That goes on to maybe a child welfare team who try and work with the family, and maybe in time the child has to come into care. Now, Joe's much more recently in the practice of this, having served as a principal social worker himself, and if maybe Joe could talk to that a little bit, I'd be very grateful.
I now classify myself as in the active retired. I was principal for over 17 years and child protection again before that, and on the board of ASW for a significant number of years. Now, Deputy Sherlock asked a lot of questions, and it's interesting that you do, because I think that reflects in a way like your curiosity to understand. It highlighted how complex it is. And just maybe just as a little preamble to that, if I may, is that I'm delighted to be here because I would consider the Dáil as kind of hallowed ground, a very important place for all Irish citizens. And I'm always in a bit of awe when I come here, and I've come here on a few occasions, and I've always kind of been interested in politics and how important it is. So I really appreciate the value and the work of what you do on behalf of us citizens. And I even tinkered with the idea of maybe entering into the field, but in my constituency it's very well served with Minister Coveney, Micheál Martin, Michael McGrath, Donegal O'Leary, so I think I'll give it a miss. So I think this will be as far as I'll get.
Questions are coming, Joe, if you want to put on the jersey.
I just put it there because to show how significant and important it is that this issue of staff retention and recruitment within TUSLA is. And I think we're talking more specifically about staff retention and recruitment within child protection and welfare service. And really, when we talk about the recruitment and retention of social workers within child protection and family welfare, we're actually talking about child protection in essence, and what regard we give it, how we value it, and what we're doing about it. And you know better than me that child protection in the history of our relatively new republic and state, child protection hasn't always been a priority, much to the contrary, and that's where we get our industrial schools, all the various scandals of Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes, institutional abuse at various levels. So I'm delighted that child protection and welfare is within the political arena, because that's where it very much belongs, because we're talking about political commitments and political priorities. And maybe, definitely hasn't always got the priority and the commitment it deserves, because we're talking about the most vulnerable of Irish society, the hidden side of it that has been referred to already by Anya. And I suppose I was accompanying very closely the conversation you've had with the Irish Foster Care Association, and that raised some very interesting topics as were raised by the previous speakers here other days. And I suppose one of the dangers is that we tend to we run the risk of reducing the very complex work which is child protection social work to a set of tasks and a set of duties. And there's almost the impression around that everybody can do it, or anybody could do it. And I don't think it's as black and white as that. It's not as simple as that. It's far more complex. And just to take, it'd be very hard to give you a picture of what actually a social worker does at any given time, because they have different roles. But once a referral comes in and once it's activated, immediately the assessment begins of what to do with it, what the needs are, to identify them, and then to put in a kind of a plan of action and engage with the family, with the children, to see what's done. And there may be different people then involved with that. You have the duty and intake that do the screening and the initial contact. Then decisions are made whether it needs further contact or not, further assessment, and then decisions may be to go to court or not, work in the community, preventative and supportive work. But I suppose one thing that was mentioned earlier, and it's key to all this, I think, is that social work, and I think one of the last speakers mentioned of it, is that social work, and whether it be child protection or otherwise, it's very much about getting involved in people's lives, intervening with them, trying to make a difference, and trying to have good outcomes. But that depends very much on the individual, on the training, but essentially it rests upon the relationship that can be built up between the social worker and the child or the family. And that's one of the things that's at the nub of the crisis at the moment, is that social workers in child protection, for various reasons and for a lot of significant developments in the recent times, have transformed that role from what it was 15 years ago. It's not recognisable now. And that core piece of work, having enough time to develop a relationship with a child or a family over time to be able to make a difference, for many people, which is at the core of social work in any setting, is not possible. So maybe we might be able to explore that a bit further on, due to the developments that have taken place in the last 10, 15 years. And interestingly, like social work, like any other profession, it happens in a particular context. And this was mentioned by other speakers other days, and it's acknowledged that by observers and by social work field, that the decision to create a Department of Children and Youth Affairs, and subsequently the establishment of TUSLA as the Child and Family Agency, was very much a political imperative and very welcome. But it was set up far too quickly with a totally insufficient budget. And that accounts to a great extent for the immediate problems we might be experiencing. TUSLA is expected to do an awful lot, and it didn't have the wherewithal to do it, I believe, due to it was set up for too quickly, and the budget was and still is totally insufficient. Yeah.
So just to, I appreciate the point you're making, but just to assist us, and I suppose I did throw a lot of points at you there. So if for instance, right, the case comes in, it's triaged, it goes on for further assessments. If the case goes to court and a care order is required, the two questions I have is the status of the social worker in the court setting, as briefly as possible, allowing for the amount of time I have, and forgive me if I took a lot of time at the start. And secondly then, the contact time versus the administrative time. If I have an understanding of those two dynamics after your interaction with us today, and thirdly then in relation to the case that was the submission that was made to us by the chair of TUSLA, the new chair of TUSLA, who spoke about bridging courses to get people from social care maybe to social work, what your views on that would be, and how academia is dealing with it, how TUSLA is dealing with it. Everybody has acknowledged the problem. Everybody knows what the problem of recruitment is. Should we be putting in place better therapeutic solutions and counselling for social workers themselves working in child protection settings? Should we be designing family-friendly policies for social workers? It's all of those thematic areas that could contribute to a better outcome for social workers themselves, and ultimately, and most importantly, for children and families.
I think in relation to the social worker, say, when they get to the point of court, yes. When I came into social work, and I've been around for a long time now, I was just as young and just as inexperienced as any graduate walking out of college. But in those days we had time, because this was 1978, you know, we hadn't really heard about child abuse then. So over that time, over those next decades, those things emerged. So social workers like me, we got time to develop with this new knowledge and this new practice. The young social worker today comes straight out of college into that world where they may find themselves very quickly in, you know, a high court dealing with a young person who has very high needs, and they are there as applicant for TUSLA.
Okay.
And that's a very different role to being, say, for example, the guardian ad litem, or a psychologist giving an expert opinion, or anybody else. You're the applicant,
yes,
and the state is the respondent, basically. Well, the parent is the respondent, but they will be aided by the state in that regard. So you have to stand there in a very alien world, dealing with judges, barristers,
but you're subject
legal
to cross-examination.
Absolutely, and you really. And there's no time nowadays for young social workers to learn how to be that professional. They have to be able to do it when they've just got their qualification.
So there's a massive element of stress involved in that.
That's hugely stressful. You know, they are capable. They're very capable, our graduates. But it's a bit like being handed your driver's license and your first day on the motorway. You know, that's difficult. So you have to learn with experience. So over the next few years, young social workers gather that experience. There is evidence to show that if you can keep people for about 5 years in the field, they seem to get to a point where they've settled into it, they feel more professional, they feel like they know what they're doing a little bit better, and they want to stay. But it's holding the young professional in those first few years is the challenge.
And also on that is that within, you mentioned the court system, like it's very stressful, it's very daunting, and other professionals very often are given more credence and more weight.
Key.
And very often the role of the social worker is gradually being eroded. And I'll just give an example for guardian ad litems, for example. The social worker in child protection would very much see themselves there to protect the child, to advocate for the child. And very often that role is handed over to a guardian who doesn't hold statutory responsibility, can develop a relationship with the child, and their function is otherwise. So that's a role that's taken away from the social worker. Also, court has become very adversarial, and obviously due process has to be respected. But, and I know there's a bit of work being done on this, but it can be extremely adversarial where everybody is lawyered up. So if you put a young social worker, as Anya said, into that setting, and they don't have the time to gradually get used to it.
But they are represented by a solicitor.
Well, they are represented by a solicitor. Yeah. And I suppose what's happening as well, and it's linked to the whole court proceedings, is that social work practice is very much being dictated more and more by the legal world and by other professionals. And even if, another example would be, for example, that a social worker is involved with a family, maybe coming into care or otherwise, an important piece of work would be a parental assessment, which would be the bread and butter of social work. But that then is being contracted out to other professionals. So you can see bit by bit the essential role of the social worker is being limited more and more, but to highly pressurised work, but not necessarily specifically.
So, Chair,
yeah.
Just because this is getting to where my understanding is developing now. If the social worker goes into court, the social worker is represented, but in an adversarial system, like the social worker presumably historically would have made the assessment and say, look, this is my recommendation, the child should go into whatever setting is the most appropriate setting. Historically, presumably, that would have been accepted by the judge of the day. I'm assuming, now correct me if I'm wrong, but we now have a system where there's a guardian ad litem, there's a social worker, so the guardian ad litem has legal representation, presumably, the social worker has legal representation, the child is represented via the guardian ad litem, and then there's the respondent. So you could have 5 or 6 lawyers and then probably a layer of experts in on top of that again. And presumably if there's a psychologist or a psychiatrist in the court, are you saying to me that the psychiatrist or psychologist, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, or you'll give me the appropriate profession, that they are then tasked with doing the assessment of the need or of the parent, if you will, before a judgment is made? They may be.
Each case varies. Each case varies, but everybody can be represented legally.
Okay.
So if you include the parents as well, then you'd be talking about a lot. And rightly so, you have to have due process. I suppose what we'd be very much concerned about is that the way it's developing, that childcare proceedings, do they have to take that format? Do they have to be in that setting? Do they have to be so adversarial? Because it's a stressful time for everybody, social worker and parents and as well. And I suppose if you take a young social worker who comes in and is handed a caseload where there may be court proceedings, that in itself is overwhelming and daunting and huge pressure. And without manageable caseloads well supervised, without a gradual induction into the whole thing, it can be very overwhelming, and quite soon they're thinking of, I need to get out of here. So when we talk about recruitment and retention of social workers, and it's what can be done to keep what we already have should be the priority. And court is just one very small aspect of it, very significant, but one.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm gonna pause you there. I'm gonna let Deputy Neville in. I can let you back later if you wish, Deputy Neville. Yeah, but let Deputy Neville, please. No, because we've had about 20 minutes now. So, just to be fair to the Deputy.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
thanks for coming in. Just a couple of quick questions in relation to our own recruitment and your take on it. First of all, I'm drawing a correlation here from, because I sit in the mental health committee, and obviously there's been recruitment issues that have arisen there because a lot of the recruitment takes place on a national platform as opposed to locally. Secondly, people are on these panels and they're quite restrictive, these panels. They need to be more flexible. So I'd just like, is there a correlation there between both, because they're both from the health, coming from the HSC? Secondly, then, in relation to recruitment itself, and you're saying about the graduates and the pressure the graduates feel coming into the workforce. As an ex-teacher, when I graduated and went into school the first day, obviously I went into the classroom on my own and I kicked off and I started, and it's quite daunting, and there is a time where you get up to speed, but I would have had senior staff that you could have called on, not directly but indirectly, part of your collegiality, that you would work on for advice, or principal teacher or vice principal teacher or whatever, that would work on advice. Or I worked in, say, woodwork, so there would have been existing woodwork teachers there that I could speak to in relation to a class. So is there something built up around that? Secondly, again, before I understand it's a point system now to get into the course, that in times gone by there would have been an interview process for some courses for college. Would you see a value in that being brought back that would maybe alleviate a dropout rate or alleviate people? And this is no disrespect to people. When people are 16, 17, 18 years of age and they're asked what they're going to do for the rest of their lives, it's an extremely difficult question for them to answer. That stage, that these professions, particularly vocational type professions, nursing, teaching, social worker, that people would get a flavour of that and an understanding of what they're going into, as opposed to, well, look, I'm going to do this, get the points, go into the profession, get the job, and then realise after 2 years that this is not for me. You know what I mean? So it's kind of a guidance or a career guidance path that could be used. Has there been any talks around that? Because obviously it's a very demanding profession, a very rewarding profession, and there's certain people out there who are, you know, as I say, for any profession, are fit for it. So that dropout rate or whatever, or that pressure rate could be alleviated, coupled with the fact that obviously supports. And what kind of supports are in place then for people who are starting the profession to get to that 5-year period to where they, as you said, they feel confident or in situ in relation to the role that they're able to deal with. So.
Go backwards with those in relation to getting into college and social workers. By and large, there are many people would do a primary degree in something like social science was the traditional one, but it could be social care. There would be a few allied ones, and then a master's in social work. Or there is a 4-year degree in Trinity and in Cork. Where people will come straight through, but that is the less, you know, the sort of the degree and the masters kind of is the similar to a lot of professions. To get a place in any of those courses, you have to be interviewed. There's always been interviews to get into social work courses, because you're right, it's not for everybody, and in order to help the course providers to decide who is more suitable, the interview is part of the process. The panels, the issue of kind of panels, it's the whole kind of government public service way of recruiting seems to be this very intricate system of national recruitment with panels here that, you know, and a very long way of getting from application.
Yeah, can I interject there? Because do you know how many steps it takes from start of the recruitment process to the end of the recruitment
For social work, my understanding is, for TUSLA, in TUSLA, my understanding is they apply through the TUSLA recruit.
Yeah. But you don't have, because I remember in the mental health committee, we got a breakdown for a psychiatric nurse, the steps, 1, 2, 3, I think it was about 26, 27 steps to go through to actually get hired. So do you have,
no,
you may not have that.
No, my understanding is that because I spoke to a number of young graduates who are employed in TUSLA prior to today, and my understanding is a lot of those are employed by agencies.
Right.
But my understanding is that there's a rolling recruitment for TUSLA now. They have on their website, you can go onto their website and you'll see that they're always looking for social workers. So I presume when they have sufficient numbers, they have interview panels and they interview people. And then they give out expressions of interest. So you're asked.
Sure, yeah, but I think my question, and you might be able to answer it, given your, is on the back end, the decision making in relation to vetting candidates. You know, what are the steps? How many stakeholders does that CV have to go to before they decide who they're going to interview? You know, how many stakeholders does it go to with the decision, once the interview is done, who actually vets, well, are we going to hire this person or not? All those internal steps. Is there any...
My understanding is that, no, it's TUSLA Recruit is the only stakeholder here, really.
Okay.
Other than vetting and things like that.
Internally in TUSLA, how many steps does that... let's just say I interview a candidate.
I don't know specifically.
That's fair enough,
Neville.
Yeah. But see, that has an effect.
I don't think it's anything like the number you mentioned for psychiatric personnel, but there would of course be Garda vetting involved.
I understand.
There would be references, all of that kind of thing. I think what my concern would be that it in such a shortage, it seems to take a long time to get the person from interview and panelling into the job.
Yeah, and that's why I was asking the question about all the process internally. That's probably stretching it, delaying it.
It seems to be the way public service is done, is that people go on panels and you have expressions of interest, and then I don't know how many people ahead of me have put in an expression of interest for the same post or area I might want to go to. So it always strikes me as a very convoluted way of doing things. In the past, there were more perhaps local ways of recruiting, but to do things in any large national way seems to just take a lot of time. In terms of young supervision, there have They have increased the number of team leaders, and the team leader is the immediate supervisor of the social worker. So a team leader will have something between 4 and 6 social workers to supervise. Where that becomes difficult is if that team, say the team of 6, because 3 people leave, is reduced to 3, you then have 3 unallocated caseloads that are the responsibility of that team leader. And they're trying to plug the gaps.
Yeah.
When the foster care phones, when the child disappears, runs away from their placement, whatever, when their court case has to be back in court. And so that becomes, that makes the support, of course, then gets a bit diluted, because it's more difficult to support your workers when you're overwhelmed with work yourself. So that needs to be addressed, is how you support those first-line supervisors to do that job of supervising, so that the young social worker is supported and encouraged to stay and gather their experience.
And I suppose there are variations around the country. Not all teams will be the same. Not all teams will be equally, would have the same workforce.
Yeah, and I suppose again you mightn't have these figures. Would some of the panels or expressions of interest around the country be oversubscribed?
Yeah, I was just going to refer a bit to that, because some of the changes which haven't helped, or some of the developments preceded TUSLA, and one was the centralisation of recruitment.
Yeah.
So there was a time there up to recently whereby you'd have multiple national panels, and then TUSLA, the emergence of TUSLA Recruit, you've also know the possibility of having regional panels and maybe bespoke panels. But I suppose what would be really helpful is if the recruitment could be returned more locally, because as it stands, the local manager doesn't have any say really who comes to work with him or her. Okay. There's no direct input.
So is it HR that makes all the decision?
Well, if your recruitment is centralised nationally,
yeah.
Then, but I do think that TUSLA Recruit is a welcome development, but it can manage, and it could manage all the recruitment process, but maybe let it happen more locally.
I worked in recruitment in the private sector, and the companies that I worked in relation to recruitment, you would HR and you'd have a line manager, and both together would make a decision on who to hire. Yeah, you know, it wasn't one or the other, so that kept the local aspect of it. So
but if you're recruiting nationally, I suppose.
But this was done. Yeah, but this was done in a national format. This would be done through a central database. But the interview would take place with the hiring manager and the HR manager, and both would decide on who to hire. But what you're telling me, it's that just one central function will make a decision on the hiring, and that the line manager doesn't really have a say in that. They just. Is that what you're? Okay, that's no problem.
That has been the trend, but I think it has. There are efforts to change it, but the sooner that recruitment is brought back locally, the better. And just on recruitment, there was mentioned in the previous speakers as well about CPL, private agencies, and that really needs to be looked at, because it's also another form of stress for social workers. I don't believe that most on CPL don't intend or wouldn't like to stay with TUSLA. That's how they enter into it. But
specific
all right, sorry.
There's plenty of firms involved.
Sorry, there are,
you understand my
company,
point.
sorry.
Thank you.
Certainly tendered, so it's a matter of public record.
We'll let Mr.
With all due respect.
to his own point.
What I was going to say was that someone might come in to work with TUSLA through a recruitment agency and would like to stay permanent, so they have to go on panels, and then that whole process might take a...
No conversion contract?
No, there's not.
Okay.
But even while they're on a contract with the private agency, they don't have the same entitlements. They don't have sick benefits. They don't have pension contributions.
They're on contract, yeah.
So I think that that's something that could be looked at quite easily, and suggestions around that are made in the fuller submission.
What happens in the private sector there a lot of times is if you're on a contract with an agency and you do 6 months or 12 months, there's actually a clause there in the contract that the company can buy the contractor off the contracting company, and you get made permanent.
But it would be good maybe if there was more thought given to temporary contracts with the agency. That used to be the case before. Okay. And I suppose just in relation to the team leaders and the principal social workers involved in child protection, when we talk about child protection, recruitment and retention, we're talking about them as well, because they are central to the delivery of a service, team leaders and principals. And there's also becoming an increased difficulty in maintaining them because of the similar reasons that are leading to an exodus of social workers.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Deputy Neville. Deputy Mitchell, do you want to?
Yeah, just briefly, thanks very much for your presentation. I think we have everything we need, you know, in this here today. But if I can just ask you, you say on one of them that you met recently with Jim Gibson from TUSLA. I'm just wondering, did you present this to TUSLA, and what was their reaction?
We meet 3 to 4 times a year. It's difficult to get time. In fact, for all of the meetings, the ISW is the board is a voluntary board. I, as chair, am a completely voluntary person on that. So I can't get to all the meetings and all the people that would like to meet us, which is really encouraging. But so we do try. We see TUSLA as extremely important because they are one of the largest employers of social workers in the country, and so we meet with them 2 to 3 times a year. Our aim has always been 3 to 4, but we don't quite make it. And our meetings are productive. I think there's a lot of common ground. But I think somewhere it gets lost in translation sometimes between what the very senior management would aspire to and how that gets translated on the ground. And there's all sorts of reasons for that, one being the insufficient number of social workers on the ground. It's just a fact. There are more posts in all forms of social work than there are social workers, so you're going to get people leaving the most difficult work to go to something that they see as being a little easier.
Yeah. No, because a lot of this is common sense, what's here, you know what I mean? And if I was TUSLA watching here, I think I would be looking to pick up the phone and have a chat, which is ASAP to, you know, address some of these, because there's one point there where we raised this previously with the Minister, Minister Spohn, and she said that we would look into this. It was about providing skill admin assistance. And that's common sense, you know what I mean? So this is a lot of stuff here that's not rocket science, you know, we're not reinventing the wheel here, you know. So I'm just wondering that, coming from this, that maybe there is an opportunity that we should be, you know, maybe, Chair, if we could have TUSLA and ask them, had they, you know, considered any of these options?
And it is like a lot of suggestions were given, and I know colleagues around the country have sent in more suggestions, and there's not a shortage of suggestions around what needs to be done to maintain staff. Obviously, working environment, support staff, which would include admin. But I think the key point has to be as well that your workforce is the most valuable resource you have when delivering a service. With the high turnover rate, and I think it's important also that not all social workers within TUSLA are leaving. The turnover really is more specific to this cohort of people that work on the front with child protection and family welfare. And there are a lot of developments, good developments happening in TUSLA, preventative and supportive work, involvement of practitioners in research. But the key question is, who is going to do it? And in relation to the key issue is retaining what you already have, building supports so that people who come in will want to stay. And if you can stop the exodus of so many social workers, then bit by bit you can build up your cohort and people will be attracted into it. And that's why we need to tread with a certain amount of caution when we talk about recruitment and recruiting more. I mean, there's an assumption that all childcare leaders or workers will want to become child protection social workers. And maybe they would if the role was defined in a different way and they had the capacity to do the work that they wanted to do, all aspects of it. And the other danger is if you follow the examples like in England where you have a quick course to convert people from certain certain professions into child protection, that's not working there. And I suppose we have to be careful as well of not dumbing down the profession. I mean, many other professions wouldn't accept kind of conversations of having a quick entry, dumbing it down, and also the danger of not reducing social work just to tasks. And the nice tasks, take away from social worker and give it to someone else, but the heavy lifting is still left with social workers. That has to be avoided. And even to take up a point made by the fostering around access, other people can do access. But if you're talking about the social worker has the statutory responsibility, access in fact can be a very important part of it, as is building up a relationship with the child, the family and the foster family.
No, I think that retention is such an important issue, and I think not only for TUSA as an organisation, but particularly for the children, because you've touched the nail on the head. There's children here and families who have fantastic, relationships with social workers, and some that's travelled on, after the children leave care and all. So I think that the children have to be key to this, and I think we need to really retain the quality, skilled staff that we have, and we have to give, we need to go beyond. So even on that, I think that even as an organisation, it needs to be doing stuff itself in around its staff well-being, because it is a hard job to do. It's an emotional job. Some social workers, I sometimes wonder, how does a social worker unwind or, take itself away when it goes back to their own family, environment, because it is a hard job to do.
I think that's a very good point, because I think social work is not for everybody.
Yeah.
It does require very resilient people, resilient emotionally, people who are able to I suppose, experience the worst, because some of the lives that some of our children have are very, very traumatic, and a social worker has to experience that in this sector, and be able to go back perhaps to their own children and their own family and get on as, and it's that's why I say social work is not for everybody. I think in relation to additional courses, we just this year, Maynooth have just started a course, and hopefully they'll get their accreditation from Carew, and Sligo, no, Maynooth haven't started yet, they'll start next September, and Sligo this year started a course, Sligo IT, and they will be hoping to get accreditation. We have to remember now that social work is, and it was the first of the allied health professions to be, social care professions to be regulated. It's a regulated profession, it's a protected title. And the courses that qualify people to use that protected title have to fulfil Carew's remit for what constitutes a good course to qualify a social worker. What we know is, we're hearing that the situation in England, they're not at all happy with these courses where they have they're qualifying just social workers to work in a kind of a child welfare sector. Social work typically is a broad qualification, so you don't qualify a lawyer just to work in family law. You qualify them to be a lawyer, and then they will get experience and specialise in an area. It's the same with doctors, the same with everybody. So it's really important to keep that. That they don't have the breadth of education and experience. Typically, our social workers, they would spend 6 months in placement. When you hear people talking about doing these courses where people would spend part of the time working, that is the professional social work course anyway. People do 2 long placements of 3 months each, and one of which must be in a sector such as probation or TUSLA, child welfare, and then the other in a different sector, perhaps mental health or medical social work or whatever. So at the end of that, you have a person who has trained, who's experienced a couple of areas of social work, and who makes a decision about what they might like to do in terms of their work. But they're doing it from a broad educational base, from a broad knowledge base, and from having, rather than these courses in England seem to be aiming to produce people to work in this sector just. And
okay, sorry to interrupt your question. Okay, I understand that, but I'm just trying to understand, I mean, why is that an issue?
so if you go to,
For us.
I have heard that
I mean, there might be concern in the UK, and that's fine.
They
They're
may
entitled
not
to have
get,
their concern. What's the context in terms of Ireland? And
yeah, they may not get, the Carew may not register them. They may not qualify to be registered with Carew.
have they given any indication that that was their intention, or
Because they look at the
is
course
it just based upon the experience in the UK?
if somebody from the UK would have to go to Carew to and give all their documentation,
Of course, yeah.
all the courses they've done to
Yes.
get their degree, and they have to. It's because it's a broad education. If it's purely just child welfare, they're not going to have all the other pieces that would give them the registration.
Okay. Well, I mean, okay, that fair enough as a statement, but I'm just trying to understand why you would make the assessment that Carew might not accept them as a social worker coming from the UK with a narrow field of sphere of educational expertise or qualification in a specific area. I'm just wondering, has Carew made any overtures that there will be a problem?
We would meet, ISW would meet with Carew on an annual basis.
Sure.
And it would be something that they would be concerned to make sure that any courses going forward are absolutely robust and fulfil the criteria so that the graduates from those courses are able to be registered as social workers under the current
Well, I think we as a
legislation.
committee are operating under the assumption that in order for us to meet the demand, the annual demand for social workers, we're going to have to increase the number of educational facilities and pathways to the qualification of social workers in this country, whether it be part-time, whether it be even potentially long-distance learning, you know, with certain modules and things like that. All of these things can be worked out in every profession that I'm aware of. You know, there's always going to be an element of somebody doing it on a part-time basis over a period of time, with obviously the required 9 to 5 full-time setting at the very end of the process. So whether it be universities, whether it be the ITs, whether it be the new what's it called? The new technical college. I can't think of the name of it.
Technical University Dublin, is it?
TUD, yeah, that's the one. Or anywhere else for that matter. So there's a whole lot. I'm pretty sure that that's going to be feature heavily in any report and recommendations that we as a committee write. So, I mean, to me, to hear that there's the potential for the accrediting body to say, no, that's not good enough, is slightly concerning, and that's why I want to get to the bottom of why you made that statement. So sorry for repeating the questions, but you understand why. Then I question why you would make the assumption that they may not give accreditation to that course, which is obviously key for our ability to actually meet demand. So, I mean, I would rather get specialised, and maybe this is just your view, maybe it's just their view, I'm not sure. But I would rather get the social worker in the door with a narrow qualification based on what it is what the area in the field they wish to work in, rather than, you know, not get accreditation for the course and therefore not get that throughput and not get those qualified, motivated individuals who want to go into a specific area of social work.
I suppose, not speaking for Cora, but I suppose certain criteria has to be met. It's along
no, that goes without saying. Yeah, no, I get that.
But I think the last point you're making needs more discussion about getting people qualified just for that particular area of work.
Well, I would have thought that that's their choice. I'm not sure that it is something that should be discussed by the industry representatives. I think if they want to go work there, let them go work there as long as they're qualified.
Yes, but the only point about what I was going to make there was that something has been said already, is that unless working in that setting is manageable, and people can stay there, it doesn't make much difference in increasing the number of people coming into it if they're not going to stay. And I do think that there's plenty of room, and it has been mentioned already, whereby TUSLA and the department can enter into negotiations with the colleges and think creatively about all what you mentioned. I think that's all possible. But the working environment and what needs to be done to keep people once they come in the door, however they come in, that is a key issue that can't be forgotten.
Of course, and nothing in our report is going to be operating in a silo. None of it. Absolutely every opportunity, every recommendation is going to have to say in tandem with X, Y, and Z. No, there is no one single solution to this matter. Whether it's terms and conditions, whether it's workload, whether it's a supervisor whom they don't get on with, because at the end of the day these are human beings and therefore there's always going to be issues like that, or whether it be circumstances outside of our current thinking here. So of course there has to be a broad approach to this. But yeah, look, I understand we're not at cross purposes, but yeah, I think there's
absolute scope for, and it has been done in the past, where former iterations of TUSLA have given secondments to people to go and qualify when there were shortages in social workers. And I mean, back in the past, many community welfare officers went on to do the requisite courses and became social workers and received some funding from their employer at the time. So I don't think these are new things. I think it's the Irish Foster Care Association also mentioned the fact of maybe bursaries and all of that, but that is different to giving somebody and maybe having a contract that they then have to work for you for 2 or 3 years or whatever would be the appropriate time, is different to having a course that says you're now going to qualify as you know, a social worker who can only work in TUSLA. I think it is different, and I wouldn't be, the association wouldn't be in favour of that kind of course at all.
And also this issue of recruitment and retention is a long-standing issue. It's not just now, and it's not just with TUSLA. And I know about 15 years ago you had the same crisis. It was an ongoing crisis, but I remember I was sent once by the then Southern Health Board to Chicago to recruit social workers, so it's not something new. But also around that time, in certain areas, they granted bursaries to students who were doing their masters for 2 years, and then they'd stay on in TUSLA for, I think at the time it was only just to stay on for a year. But interestingly enough, a lot of those who received that support remained in TUSLA. You know, so I think that if you invest in the student and you encourage and you have a welcoming environment and a manageable environment, people will come and people will stay. And I think that the answers, like it was mentioned about exit interviews, I mean, not that I know of, I don't think exit interviews are carried out routinely, but the reasons why people are leaving, the majority of the reasons are known. But the social workers who are in situ and who would love to continue remaining in child protection and family welfare, they can indicate very clearly what needs to be done.
Okay. Deputy Mitchell, anything further? Okay. Well, thank you very much, and on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank you for your presentation and for dealing with members' questions in such a comprehensive way. The meeting of the Joint Committee is adjourned until Wednesday, 10th of April at 10 a.m. when the committee will meet representatives of the Technological Higher Education Association and the Department of Social Science, IT, SLIGO, to consider its consideration of the topic of recruitment and retention of social workers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.